Our agenda is the introduction to the introduction. That is, next time we look forward to beginning the actual introduction to Sefer HaKuzari, but we have some business to which we need to attend before we even get there. And that's the reason for today's topic, Introduction to Jewish Philosophy. What is classic rabbinical thought, and who needs it all together? I'd like to divide our discussion today into three distinct components, maybe even to pause for some further clarification and discussion between each component. The first will pertain to a general question of what is philosophy and who needs philosophy. I am unabashedly cribbing that title from a well-known book by an unfortunately self-denying Jew, Ayn Rand. But be that as it may, her answer to the question was everyone does. We're going to have to figure out our answer as well. Second question is going to be what is Jewish philosophy, which inevitably must on some plane be distinct from the general question about philosophy. And finally, this creature that appears in the title, what is classic rabbinical thought? We'll need to clarify what that means as well. So, without any further ado, let's plunge into the first of these discussions. What is philosophy? Perhaps a good way of beginning is with an old story. Anecdotal definitions certainly leave something to be desired, but they're often good icebreakers. So the story pertains to a young man who was about to go out on his very first date, and completely flustered at the prospect of speaking to a member of the opposite sex for the first time, he asks his older buddy, what am I supposed to talk about? Whereupon his sagacious friend tells him, there are three guaranteed safe topics: family, hobbies, and philosophy. So there he is, first night, speaking to a girl for the first time in his life. Question number one, family. Do you have a brother? No. Scratch family. Next, hobbies. Do you collect stamps? No. Well, forget about hobbies too. Let's see. Forget about hobbies. Forget about family. Philosophy. 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 If you had a brother, would he collect stamps? The old story defining philosophy as what is about as utterly useless, speculative, irrelevant as could possibly be. So this is the way I launch on our definition of philosophy, because I hope it's clear that is not philosophy. There is something to be gained by trying to define something by way of negation, although I freely concede that this is a woefully inadequate definition. That is to say that the philosophy in the story is wrong. So what is philosophy? What do we mean when we invoke the term? Well, as a basis for discussion, perhaps we can consider this dictionary definition of philosophy. Now, I must concede that I've included the entire definition here for the sake of completeness, but I'd really like to focus on a couple of components of the definition that I think are especially germane for the purposes of our discussion. Because, of course, while a rigorous definition that philosophy means love of knowledge is true, it is, after all, the Greek, but it's pretty well useless in trying to understand what we mean when we speak of a philosophy in our parlance today. Parenthetically, you might say, this whole discussion of what the word means, isn't this all semantics? To which, of course, I'll respond, you bet it's semantics, but since semantics, after all, is the sole means that we have through which to communicate language, we better pay attention to semantics if we're going to know what we're talking about. So, let's consider this definition over here. the investigation of causes and laws underlying reality. What inevitably that definition presumes is some well-defined reality. And of course, we're going to have to try to understand what that could possibly mean here. What do we mean by reality? And as such, then, what is the philosophical enterprise that is addressing that reality? So without attempting an exhaustive level of rigor here, let's say that what we mean by reality is some set of givens that our philosophical enterprise is going to address. By that, I mean that inevitably there's got to be some set of axioms, something that we presume about the nature of reality as the basis for discourse. We recognize fairly self-evidently that we're not going to be able to prove everything, and as a result, there needs to be some starting point. That set of givens is our starting point. The philosophical enterprise is then an attempt to impose upon such a set of givens some kind of methodology with the goal of coming up with some kind of systematic understanding. Now, I realize I'm being nebulous. I'm being intentionally, perhaps obnoxiously nebulous. But I think in general terms, the realization that when we engage in a philosophical enterprise, we're doing something along these lines is a critical starting point. First and foremost, because it enables us to distinguish between what we do when we do philosophy and what we do when we just engage in data gathering. That is, data gathering gives you a lot of data points. That's not philosophy. Philosophy is subjecting all that data to some kind of systematic understanding. Again, addressing it with some kind of methodology. I apologize if it sounds like I'm making a mountain out of a molehill and making life excessively complicated. But as we inevitably see further down the road, by getting a handle at the outset of what we mean by the words we use, we can spare ourselves a lot of grief further down the road. Now, once we take this as, again, perhaps undoubtedly not an exhaustive definition, but a starting point definition of what we mean by philosophy, we inevitably ask the second question, which is, who needs it? Or perhaps better yet than asking who needs it, who does it? Who engages in this endeavor of taking the data, taking the set of givens, and trying to impose upon it some kind of systematic understanding? I think casting the question in that vein inevitably leads to pretty much a self-evident answer. That is, who does this? Everyone does this. This is the hallmark of being human. Certainly, engaging in any sort of conscious, deliberate thought. And in expressing myself in these terms, perhaps it is instructive to consider a contrast of sorts. What distinguishes the way we view reality from the way a dog views reality? Well, of course, you might argue, we don't know the way dogs view reality. We haven't had any conversations with them. And I grant that certainly is the case. But simultaneously, from what we can see of canine behavior, when a dog looks at the world, the dog, on the level of seeing what's taking place, isn't a whole lot different from what we do in seeing what is taking place. Striving to answer, if we could express it this way, the mechanistic what. What is happening? What is going on? Granted, there may be technical differences, acuity of color vision, what have you, but on that mechanistic what, level, the way we view the world and the way Pooch views the world are pretty similar. The crucial difference lies not in what we see, but rather what we don't see. Because human beings are never satisfied with only observing the mechanistic what. They also ask the causative why. The striving to interpret, indeed, cannot be satisfied with the data gathering, the facts on the ground alone. Because the moment that we ask why, the moment that we engage in that interpretive process, let it be clear, what we definitely are not doing is merely observing. Because the interpretation necessarily, I would even say, definitionally, is not what you see. It's what you construe it to mean by your exercise of your mind. The moment you do that, the moment, in short, you are dissatisfied with merely the mechanistic what and go beyond that, is the moment at which you have ceased to be merely a data gatherer and have become a philosopher. So, of course, inevitably, we recognize everyone does it, and arguably, everyone needs to do it. Who needs philosophy? Randall's right about this. We all do. We all do, because viewing the world as anything less, merely as the basis for data gathering, is so woefully inadequate. It really doesn't even pass muster. This, from my perspective, completes our discussion of the first component. That is, again, what is philosophy and who needs philosophy? Now we need to consider the second and third. As a backdrop for our moving on to the second question, that is, what do we mean by Jewish philosophy? I think it's important for us to appreciate the extent to which, of course, inevitably, the breadth of our opening definition is intended to accommodate a whole gamut of various philosophies, which, of course, inevitably will be predicated upon different sets of givens. So, for example, obviously in a philosophy of science, the givens will include the information that we have with respect to the functioning of the natural world. The givens may include assumptions that we have with respect to natural law. And the task of the philosopher of science is to integrate those givens into some kind of systematic understanding. Take another example, philosophy of political thought. There also, inevitably, the givens will include various premises upon which the philosophy will operate, a different set of premises, not so much those that underlie physical reality, but rather those that underlie society, the interactions among people, the systems of governance, and so on and so forth. Obviously, we can employ innumerable examples here, but the principle, again, is that the data set per se is not what provides the meaning. It's the system that is imposed upon the data set. Those who may be more inclined toward a mathematical analogy could think of the distinction as being between mapping data points and generating a function, a curve, that passes through the data points. The data points per se do not provide any basis for articulating the function, for understanding the curve. Obviously, they provide the basis indirectly, but only because you, in evaluating the data, choose to evaluate it in a certain manner and produce the system that you produce. And of course, inevitably, this brings us to the question of what we mean by Jewish philosophy. So how do we define Jewish philosophy? Inevitably, Jewish philosophy, like the other philosophies that we've mentioned, is a philosophy. So the definition that we used with respect to general philosophy must necessarily apply. It is necessary. It is not sufficient. Because while any Jewish philosophy is pretty much by definition a philosophy, not every philosophy is Jewish. And that, of course, inevitably presents to us the next challenge, which is how do we define a philosophy as Jewish? There is an inclination that we find in certain circles to base the definition, at least in part, upon ethnicity, that the philosophy is articulated by Jews. So it is that in Encyclopedia Judaica, at the beginning of the very well articulated essay on the subject of Jewish philosophy, we read, Jewish philosophy may be described as the explication of Jewish beliefs and practices by means of general philosophic concepts and norms. Hence, it must be seen as an outgrowth of the biblical and rabbinic traditions on which Judaism rests, as well as part of the history of philosophy at large. We're going to return to that sentence shortly. But he continues, this description must, however, be expanded to include the general philosophic literature in Hebrew produced by Jews in the latter part of the Middle Ages, and the various secular philosophies of Jewish existence formulated by modern Jewish thinkers. Such is proposed here, and I must stridently, vehemently beg to differ. If we are to define a philosophy as Jewish because those who are articulating it are Jews, then, for example, we would be constrained to define Marxism as a form of Jewish philosophy. You know, Marx was, at least by birth, Jewish. So you might say, well, we're not speaking of political movements, we're speaking of religions. So a religion, a religious philosophy that is articulated by Jews, we will define as a Jewish philosophy. Well, as I'm sure is clear to all of you, that would, of course, include Christianity. Christianity, after all, was first formulated by Jews. Since I dare say most people, certainly I among them, would feel rather uncomfortable coming up with a definition of Jewish philosophy that would include Christian philosophy, clearly a definition that will provide no further lines of demarcation than ethnicity is inadequate. It may be as an inescapable accident of reality that those who engage in Jewish philosophy are probably, for the most part, ethnically Jewish. After all, to dedicate one's life to a field usually requires, on a human plane, some basis for that interest and devotion, and that interest may indeed be predicated upon ethnicity, but it's not going to provide us with a definition. No, in order to come up with a definition, I think we need to return to our definition of philosophy generally. Every philosophy operates upon a set of givens and imposes upon that set of givens, again, some system that is an outgrowth of the methodology employed by the philosopher engaging in the enterprise. Well, that general definition works for Jewish philosophy as well, so long as we define a set of givens. Just as philosophy of science will have its set of givens, and of political thought will have its set of givens, Jewish philosophy has its set of givens. I'm sure this isn't a really outlandish innovation for anybody. There is a set of givens upon which Judaism is predicated. It is, in a word, the Torah that is given. Now, exactly what is included in that catchword Torah is, of course, a subject that we ought to discuss at far greater length, and if we were going to attempt far greater rigor in our definitions, we would have to discuss it at far greater length. But for our purposes at present, my concern is simply to distinguish a Jewish philosophy from a philosophy that isn't Jewish. The point of distinction, critically, is that if the philosophy is a Jewish philosophy, the givens that underlie it are the givens of Judaism. The givens, then, of Torah. Inevitably, while an exhaustive definition of what the Torah gives us would probably take us well beyond both our scope and our time frame, we do need to ask ourselves, at least on a basic plane, so, what are the givens? What is the Torah? What does it do? As I'm sure everyone is well aware, Torah, which unfortunately, and a subject of great regret for me on manifold planes, usually gets translated as law. Doesn't mean law, it means teaching. Well, what is it teaching? It's not just teaching us laws, that's for sure, but it is teaching us a way of life. And to that extent then, on the most basic plane, when we ask ourselves, upon what set of givens does Jewish philosophy operate? The set of givens is the way of life that Judaism provides. I'm stressing this point because it provides us with an additional problem that we need to address. And that is, I'm skipping, for purposes of our discussion here, to definition number 10. Not because the definitions in the interim are inconsequential, but because I think we have a very well-established inclination to include definition 10 in what we mean by a philosophy. And given what we just said regarding the set of givens of Torah, definition 10 is the problem. Definition 10 tells us that philosophy represents the system of values by which one lives. In other words, we expect of a philosophy to have practical ramifications with respect to life. The problem, of course, inevitably is that works very well if the philosophical enterprise leads to practical conclusions. Of course, in Jewish philosophy, it doesn't. It can't. This is a critical point for us to appreciate. The practical conclusions aren't conclusions. They are premises. The givens of Torah are the givens that underlie any Jewish philosophy. If, for that matter, then, a putative Jewish philosophy were to conclude that any of the givens of Torah are fallacious or inapplicable or irrelevant, based upon our definitions, we might indeed regard such a philosophy as a philosophy that could be worthy of study, could be worthy of exploration, could be worthy of consideration in any number of other arenas, but a Jewish philosophy, it isn't. Again, the definition of the Jewish philosophy is being predicated upon the set of givens. The problem inevitably that this raises is, where does the philosophy come in? When we recognize that to the extent that we might otherwise have expected from a philosophy practical conclusions, the practice is already there at the outset. It's in the Torah. I think there are a number of planes at which we need to address this issue. The first, of course, rather self-evidently, recognizing that the Torah is not, of course, exclusively practical. There are many statements in the Torah that are manifestly conceptual and not merely practical. Where do we find the first such statement in the Torah? Well, how about Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, the first verse of the Torah? Speaking about God in the context of creation is manifestly speaking about something that does not directly have practical ramifications. Now, I can't help but note here that inevitably that very realization famously underlies the first comment by Rashi at the beginning of his Perush on the Torah, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Why does the Torah begin with the story of creation instead of with the first mitzvah that was given to the people of Israel? Because, after all, if our premise is the Torah is there to give us givens, and those givens are practical givens, then making abstract, speculative, philosophical statements, like speaking about creation, shouldn't be part of the Torah. Now, of course, on the one hand, Rashi's response to his question, essentially, as many of the super commentaries on Rashi note, perhaps especially noteworthy, Maharal in Gur Aryeh, is that in as much as the ultimate goal of the Torah is for it to be practiced in the land of Israel, the Torah is, as Ramban notes repeatedly, based upon the verses in Sefer Melachim, in the Book of Kings, too, Mishpat Elokei Haaretz, the law of the God of the land. To that extent, then, establishing our bond to the land of Israel does indeed have practical ramifications. And inasmuch as the Torah's description of creation, Rashi posits, is there for that reason, there are practical ramifications involved. Simultaneously, I don't think it comes as any surprise to any of us that while Rashi's question and answer are definitely important objects of study, neither makes the inescapable conclusion evaporate that the Torah is not only there to give us rules of conduct. And of course, inevitably, to that extent, when we consider what the Torah is giving us, the givens pertain to far broader vistas than only what to do. If anything, by consequence, we recognize that to the extent that Torah is telling us what to do, giving us a way of life, what we discern in the enterprise of Jewish philosophy is something of an inversion of what we generally expect from philosophy, at least philosophy that is conforming to definition number 10 over here. That is, to the extent that we generally expect a philosophy to proceed from a set of givens to practical ramifications, where generally the set of givens is subjected first to some sort of conceptual analysis, and only afterward you get to practical ramifications. In Jewish philosophy, we start out with practical ramifications. We start out with what to do, and only based upon that, and in its wake, do we get to what the ideas are. That is, do we get to what the ideas are if we get there altogether? Because as we ask the question with general philosophy, so too here with respect to Jewish philosophy. Who needs Jewish philosophy? Isn't it enough, if you'll pardon my being a little bit reductionist here, for us merely to equip ourselves with a Kitur Shulchan Aruch, a code of Jewish law, that tells us what to do in order to obey the mandates of the Torah and keep it with that? So, who needs Jewish philosophy? Of course, predictably, in as much as everything that we've said about Jewish philosophy is, after all, a subset of general philosophy, my response here is we all do. That is, at least all Jews. Just as all human beings need philosophy, on the assumption that I think is well borne out that all Jews are human beings, we all need Jewish philosophy. That is, we all need to go beyond the confines of the mechanistic what in pursuit of a causative why. The givens of Torah only provide us on the sketchiest of planes with the basis of that causative why. And just as in general philosophy, that interpretive plane is something that we impose on our observations. We impose that causative why in constructing a philosophy of Judaism based upon its givens. Of course, inevitably, in asking this question, who needs Jewish philosophy? Besides the basic human need, we need to consider whether indeed halakha by itself is enough. Well, formally, in order to act in an appropriate manner, halakha may be enough. But I think it's important for us to consider what, within the broader framework of what we've discussed already, would be lacking under such circumstances. If I can first share with you another anecdote. I have an acquaintance who is an eminent Talmid Chacham who told me that one of the pastimes that he enjoys, I suppose enjoys is a somewhat loaded term in the context, is inviting over yeshiva seminary students to his home for Shabbat, and at some point during the meal, springing the question on them, why are you religious? I think he finds it amusing to see the unsettling degree to which even learned, experienced students hem and haw without the ability to answer that question coherently. I think we should regard that as a problem. To employ a metaphor as an analogy here, the halakha, the laws, the givens in this case, we can consider to be bricks, building materials. And of course, from the totality of Torah, we have mounds and mounds of bricks. From mounds and mounds of bricks, however, you still don't have a place to live. What's necessary beyond the mounds of bricks? Well, first of all, you need a blueprint. Not just a blueprint on paper. You also need the general plan of the building that is to be your home. Putting up the cross beams, putting up the general arrangement, mind you, with the realization that they may change. Indeed, inevitably will change over the course of your sojourn in this home. But you need some framework to guide you in the placement of the bricks if you're going to be able to live there. Mounds and mounds of bricks are a lot of substance, but they're not a home. And of course, for that matter, a blueprint is obviously not a home either. Indeed, the cross beams, the general plan, even when it's put up, is also not a place to live. Besides, any idle wind can easily just knock it down like a house of cards. You need the bricks to give it solidity, stability, endurance, perseverance. In short, you need both. The givens that provide us with the bricks are an indispensable component. And indeed, I hope it's clear at this point that the philosophy must operate upon those bricks that are accepted as axiomatic, that are the givens. But there still needs to be something more than that. We should note further that that additional dimension, that plan, may actually have practical ramifications. I'm hedging here and saying may have practical ramifications because of a significant point of dissension that we find in our tradition, in the Gemara, between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara tells us a number of instances that Rabbi Shimon darish taima dikra, that Rabbi Shimon would expound the reasons for verses in Scripture, whereas Rabbi Yehuda would not. Now, it's important for us to understand, does this mean that according to Rabbi Yehuda, there is no reason for the verses? There is no plan? Does Rabbi Yehuda indeed posit that all there are bricks? My response is, no, that's not what he's saying. The question, of course, inevitably pertains to the application of the halachic process. That is, in the halachic process, do we take into consideration what we construe to be taima dikra, the reasons for the verses in Scripture? According to Rabbi Yehuda, there may indeed be reasons, but we don't expound them. We don't expound them in a halachic framework. Rabbi Shimon maintains that we do. How we decide this dissension, we won't be addressing right now. I'm really noting that, at least to the extent that there is a position that taima dikra, the reasons for the verses in Scripture, can have practical ramifications. To that extent, there may even be practical ramifications in all this. But besides that bone of contention in Talmudic literature, we should note that there are also additional dimensions in halakha that clearly, inescapably, presume something that goes beyond mere integration of halakha per se. 2 weeks ago was Pesach Sheni. Now let's consider what underlies Pesach Sheni. A group of people who were in a state of ritual defilement at the time that the Paschal offering was brought in the second year in the wilderness. And they come to complain to Moshe. Why should we miss out on the Paschal offering? In pure halachic terms, this argument is patently absurd. After all, pure halachic terms, we know if you're in a state of ritual defilement, you cannot come in contact with the consecrated meat of the Paschal offering. And in as much as you can't, you are operating in a state of compulsion, read anus, and in such circumstances, the universal principle that applies in Jewish law is antur rachmana patre. When someone is in a state of compulsion, that is operating under duress, the Torah exempts him. So under such circumstances, there's no question that these individuals, by dint of their defilement, are exempted from the Paschal offering, and they have no business asking, why should we miss out? But they did ask, because they weren't merely basing themselves upon bricks. They had evidently attained some threshold of integration. Integration in this sense meaning that the bricks, the laws, are means to something. What's it something? We can characterize it in a number of different ways. We could speak of the something being the conviction that the mitzvot are the vehicle through which we are to come closer to God, and as such, irrespective of their exemption from the Paschal offering, they don't want to miss out on that consequence. But again, it's important for us to appreciate that sensitivity is not something that comes from halakha per se. It's something that is, in the purest sense, meta halachic. In other words, it pertains to philosophy, the integration, the interpretation, that which transcends the givens per se. Take another example, a very famous example from Ramban's commentary. The principle articulated by the Torah, well, in a number of generalizations of which Ramban speaks, perhaps the best known being Kedoshim Tihu. The mandate in the Torah to be holy, meaning, sounds like an awfully vague generalization, and of course, what Ramban tells us is that's precisely the point. That is, after the Torah has given us all of the quantified mandates, the data points, the givens, the specifics. It provides us in this vague generalization of Kedoshim Tihu, be holy, with an attitude, an orientation, so that if someone merely contents himself with keeping the quantifiable mandates and ignoring the orientation, we call such an individual, in Ramban's famous turn of phrase, an aval b'yeshut HaTorah, an abomination with the Torah's license. That's not where we aim to go. And again, it's important for us to appreciate, were we basing ourselves exclusively upon the bricks, the laws, there would be no basis for our indictment of the Naval B'Yeshut HaTorah. But there is. That basis is our conviction that the bricks tend toward some structure, that there is some goal to cultivate an attitude. Now, with this realization, there is a crucial additional corollary that we need to emphasize before moving on, and that is that the attitude, the orientation, is necessarily, indeed, irreducibly subjective. That element of subjectivity is, of course, best noted when we consider the very contrast between what we would expect from a system that was intended to give us the practical mandates of a way of life, and what in fact we expect from Jewish philosophy, and as much as the mandates, the way of life, we already have in halakha. The Torah emphasizes Torah achat umishpat echad yihyeh lachem. One Torah, one instruction, teaching, and one law, one judgment shall there be for you. There is a mandate then in the Torah to establish on a practical plane some baseline of conformity of practice. Why? My response, fairly straightforwardly, is that we can readily discern in the Torah's agenda the desire to establish a covenantal community. A covenantal community, indeed, any community, necessarily needs to be bonded by some base threshold of conformity of practice. If there is no conformity of practice, there is no community. And as a result, on a practical plane, the Torah insists that there shall be one Torah, one teaching, one instruction, and one mishpat, one law, one judgment. As such, it is especially instructive for us to consider what happens when there's more than one way of looking at something. And of course, inevitably, the principle that comes to mind, and I'm sure you're all thinking about it as well, is the principle articulated famously in the Talmud, Elu va'elu divrei Elokim chayim hem. These and those are the words of the living God. But it's important for us to consider on precisely how many occasions does this expression, these and those are the words of the living God, appear in Talmudic literature? The answer is, in the Babylonian Talmud, precisely 2. There are another 4 in the Yerushalmi, in the Jerusalem Talmud, but they're all further elaborations on one of the 2 instances in the Babylonian Talmud. So we can focus on the 2 examples that we derive from the Bavli, from the Babylonian Talmud. The first, which is indeed the basis of the turn of phrase in the Jerusalem Talmud as well, is the dissension of Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. The Gemara tells us in Tractate Eruvin, page 13b, said Rabbi Abba, said Shemuel, for 3 years Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel were divided. These were saying the halacha is like us, and those were saying the halacha is like us. A divine echo went forth, and it said, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim hem. These and those are the words of the living God. But that's not all it said. It also said, Ve'halacha ki Beit Hillel. But the halacha is like Beit Hillel. That is, Again, given the need to establish this threshold of conformity of practice on a practical plane, merely leaving the discussion on this dangling plane of these and those are the words of the living God and they're both right is simply inadequate, because we need to know what to do. So the Divine Echo concludes with the instruction, what to do. That again is the first instance that appears in Tractate Eruvin on page 13b. The second instance appears in Masechet Gitin, Tractate Gitin, page 6b, where we read of the dissension between Rabbi Aviatar and Rabbi Yonatan regarding the specific circumstances in the sordid and calamitous story of Pilegesh Bagiv'ah, the concubine at Giv'ah, about which we read at the end of the book of Judges. Question that they address: what was the circumstance that prompted the husband to send her back to her father's house? And the two present different views. We won't get into all the details of the discussion. What is relevant for our purposes is, after the articulation of the dissension, the Gemara reports that Rabbi Aviatar was one of the disputants, came upon Eliyahu, the prophet Elijah, who is, of course, always someplace around. Whereupon Rabbi Aviatar asks Eliyahu, what is God doing at this point? My ka'avid HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Eliyahu's response is, he is engaging in the subject of the concubine at Giv'ah, Pilegesh Bagiv'ah. Rav Chaim Volozhiner deduces from this that on some spiritual plane, whenever you engage in any study of Torah, as it were, God himself is integrated in that study. Be that as it may, stripped of the anthropomorphisms, we still need to ask, so what is God doing? As Rabbi Aviatar goes on to ask Eliyahu, what is he saying? And Eliyahu reports, he is saying, Aviatar, my son, says thus, and Yonatan, my son, says thus. Different interpretations. Whereupon Rabbi Aviatar exclaims in horror, God forfend! Is there any doubt in the realm of heaven? Like God doesn't know? After all, we're speaking of a historical event. What actually happened? To which Eliyahu's response, these and those are the words of the living God. Now, there is a continuation here, I should note, but it's not a continuation of saying these and those are the words of the living God, but one of them is right and the other one is wrong. Or one of them is halakha and the other isn't halakha. So the Gemara gives us an allowance that somehow integrates partially the two views that had been presented previously of Rabbi Aviatar and Rabbi Yonatan. But of course, to the extent that you are integrating two views that were presented as mutually exclusive, an observation made by Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg in his writings in the Sri Eish, is that's in effect saying that neither one is right. They're both only partially correct. But of course, that's fine. Even if it's only partially correct, these and those are the words of the living God. And we don't need to say, but the halakha is like so-and-so, because it's not a question of halakha. Now, mind you, you might have thought that, if anything, in an issue such as this, the need to establish truth is all the more burning. After all, we're talking about an historical reality. Presumably something happened. But then we always need to remember that the Bible wasn't given to us as a history book. It's given as a basis for our learning, our enlightenment, our illumination. And to that extent, if more than one possibility can enlighten and illuminate us, they are both right. History is not the agenda. And so there is no need to establish halakha like one view, because It's not a question of halacha. To further illustrate this point, another similar sort of passage in the Talmud, in Tractate Megillah, Daf Tetvav Amud Bet, Tractate Megillah, page 15b, where the Gemara considers what Esther's consideration was for inviting Haman to her banquet with Achashverosh. And the Gemara gives us a list of answers. The list includes Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemia, Rabbi Yosei, Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, Rabban Gamliel, Rabban Gamliel in the name of Rabbi Elazar HaModai, Rava, Abaye v'Rava. A dozen different answers as to what Esther had in mind. And again, where is the resolution to be found? Rabba bar Avuha comes upon Eliyahu and asks Eliyahu, so what was Esther's intention? What did she have in mind? And Eliyahu's ready response is, Kechulu Tanai uchechulu Amorai. Like all of the Mishnaic sages and all of the Talmudic sages. Mind you, this dissension lasted for a number of generations. Now, how are we supposed to understand Eliyahu's response? Do we posit that Esther was really sitting there and focusing her intentions on each one of these positions in turn? Or rather, is the message of Eliyahu and the message of the Talmud in reporting it, that to the extent the answer is a correct one, it's fine. It's there. Any answer that is coherent with the givens of Torah, and internally consistent, and can teach us something, is correct. There doesn't have to be one right answer. That is, this irreducible subjectivity is, if anything, what derives inexorably from the realization that we're not using the philosophy to determine the way of life. We already have the way of life. The philosophy is guiding us to integrate those givens as we build the building of our life's philosophy based upon the givens of Judaism. Of course, in a similar vein, likewise, the Midrash in Bamidbar Rabbah in chapter 13, paragraph heading 15, the principle of Shiv'im Panim BaTorah, 70 facets of the Torah, and everyone finds his own. Ramban, in his commentary on Parashat Beha'alotcha, associates the significance of the number 70 with the gamut of all possible views. All views that are valid are there. They all have a contribution to make. And of course, inevitably then, this is a project that needs to be pursued not only by each and every individual, but by each and every individual, lifelong. Because just as each and every individual is unique, just as their faces are dissimilar from one another, so their minds are different from one another. Just as every individual is distinct, is unique, so too each individual, on an ongoing basis, continues to grow and evolve and change. There isn't just one view, even for that individual. It's a life's work. It never ends. So, embellishing the analogy to the building that has the plan and has the bricks, it's not like you build it once and you're finished. Certainly even the prefab is an ongoing endeavor that demands of us relentless effort. So on that plane, we consider the role of Jewish philosophy in our lives as, of course, a prerequisite to addressing the third and final question. With respect to that third and final question, what is classic rabbinical thought? And of course, inevitably, who needs that? Well, my definition of classic rabbinical thought inevitably is going to have to pertain to a subset of Jewish philosophy. inevitably, that's what it is. So the definition certainly doesn't change here with respect to what we have to say about Jewish philosophy generally. Rather, in defining what creature this is that I'm identifying as classic rabbinical thought, I need to base myself upon history. In particular, the historical reality that principally between the 8th and 10th centuries, the classics of Greek philosophy were translated into Arabic, and by consequence, posed to adherents of the religion who spoke Arabic, which of course meant, in particular, Muslims and Jews, the challenges that derived from a rationalist system that regarded the whole notion of revealed religion as indefensible and unsupported. That challenge that derived from rationalist philosophy precipitated an intellectual foment in the Arabic-speaking world that was unprecedented. And of course, I need to emphasize here that while I suspect we are accustomed to thinking of the medieval period as the Dark Ages, they were Dark Ages intellectually in most of Europe, in most of Christendom, but not in the Islamic world. In the Islamic world, on the contrary, it was a period of tremendous intellectual flowering. I realize that is a bit of a simplification, and when we consider the historical circumstances of Sefer Kozeri at greater length, we'll need to evaluate its appropriateness in greater rigor. But for our purposes at this point, it's important for us to appreciate all the classics of rabbinical thought were consequences of this challenge of rationalism, going back to what is arguably the first classic of rabbinical thought, Rav Saadia Gaon's Hanivchar Be'emunot V'Deyot, the chosen of beliefs and views, and continuing serially through much of the medieval period. Indeed, even after the Iberian Peninsula was largely, eventually completely, overrun by Christianity, that intellectual climate that had existed in the Iberian Peninsula in large measure persisted. So with respect to what we mean by classic rabbinical thought, of course, inevitably, what we mean is the Jewish response to these challenges that were predicated first and foremost upon rationalism. And inevitably, that brings me to the corollary question, which is, who needs it? And my answer, we do. We especially. Most of all, our generation. It is a subject of no small irony, I think, that we bear a far greater intellectual affinity to the medieval Arabic-speaking world than we do to any of the intervening periods in the development of Jewish thought. The reason being that in large measure, and there were exceptions, but in large measure, the Jews were very much integrated into the broader intellectual foment that was taking place in the Arabic-speaking world. And the challenges of rationalism that beset that world beset the Jews in subsequent generations, largely because of circumstances that were beyond our control. The Jewish world became far more insular and isolated from that which was taking place in the realm of the intellect in the surrounding society. We find ourselves today, again, very much integrated into the intellectual climate of the world around us. And once again, despite the checkered past of rationalism, the most unsettling challenge to religious belief today on an intellectual plane comes once again from the arena of rationalism. Of course, it's not rationalism in the guise of Aristotelianism. Nowadays, it's principally rationalism in the guise of science. But fundamentally, it amounts to the same essential set of challenges. The challenge of reasoning in confronting revelation. This is the challenge that was central in the works of the Rishonim, the early rabbinic commentators who were operating in the medieval world in the Islamic countries. These are the challenges, in a different guise, but of similar substance, that confront us today. We ignore these works at our peril. I have to note here, there's a dirty little secret in the religious world. Everyone who is involved in education knows about it very well. But I don't hear anyone really providing a coherent response. The dirty little secret is attrition. We are losing souls all the time. I am fully aware that there are many who will say, we're losing souls because of hedonism. We're losing souls because people want to enjoy themselves. I'm not going to deny that society has become corrosive on manifold planes, certainly not exclusively on an intellectual one, but simultaneously. If you want to engage people, you need to provide them with intellectual substance. If they have been led to believe through their own disappointments with their mentors that Judaism lacks that intellectual substance, why should they not succumb to the temptations of a hedonistic lifestyle? I'm not excusing anyone. I'm merely recognizing, ultimately, the responsibility lies with us. And that responsibility seems all the more ignored when we recognize the extent to which the giants of classic rabbinical thought already dealt with these issues. And largely in contrast to later literary developments in the realm of Jewish thought that tended to be more particularized, they provided us with holistic systems for grappling with the challenges of life, for grappling with Judaism. They provided us then with an extraordinary opportunity, an opportunity we ignore at our peril. So, when we consider who needs classic rabbinical thought, my answer emphatically is, we do. We do, first of all, because of the existential challenges that confront us today. There is an additional dimension. And this additional dimension, I feel compelled to share with you in the context of a conversation I had a number of months ago with one of the foremost leaders of world orthodoxy. And I was making this point about the criminal dereliction of our ignoring these masterpieces, and further noting that the people who, as a result, we lose the most are the people who ought to be the leaders of tomorrow. Those who are intellectually oriented, those who have the vessels, the tools, the wherewithal, and they're not getting answers. Whereupon the person with whom I was speaking, who really very much respects my attitude in this arena, but I suspect wanted to, I guess, play devil's advocate a bit, said to me, no, the leaders nowadays are the businessmen. Now, of course, there are businessmen who are prodigious intellects, who address matters of the mind on a plane that far exceeds most others. But that's not what he meant. What he meant was that in the realities of the world of Jewry today, our problems are essentially practical ones. If our communities are bankrupting, if our schools have lost their financial solvency, if people aren't able to make ends meet, and as a result, institutions are crumbling, then we have very pragmatic problems. Indeed, existential challenges. Our survival is at stake. So who's going to solve those problems? Not the great intellects, but rather the people who are pragmatists, practicality. To which I responded, you're completely right. We have these pragmatic challenges that need to be addressed. Yeah, but if we successfully field all these pragmatic challenges, we haven't formulated a coherent intellectual response to the challenges that confront us today in the arena of ideas. We may find ourselves several decades, a century down the road, with all of the existential problems of survival appropriately addressed, and people asking themselves, okay, so we saved the day for what? What do we have to offer? I cannot stress strongly enough. The world today not only is prepared to hear what we have to say from the perspective of Jewish tradition, the world wants to hear. There is a thirst, there is a hunger, there is a need in the marketplace of ideas for us to be heard. And for the most part, they hear nothing. This is a travesty. And this is a challenge, in varying degrees, for each and every one of us. Not only do we need classic rabbinical thought, the world needs us to return to classic rabbinical thought. Now, mind you, at the end of the day, does that mean that we're going to become either the disciples of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, or disciples of Rambam, or disciples of Ramban, or disciples of somebody else? Ultimately, the subjective enterprise of Jewish thought impels us, as we already noted, to construct our own edifices. And that means an ongoing process, that means an ongoing struggle, but that means, first and foremost, we need to get to work. And that, if anything, is the most critical bottom line of this introduction to Jewish philosophy. We need to get to work. And by our getting to work, we at the very least can aspire to being able to address and redress these challenges. So in needing to get to work then, we continue next time with our first installment in an introduction to Sefer HaKuzari.